Welcome to ETM's first take of the market. I'm joined by Director George Glenos for this. George, I was offline this entire weekend, and ever since I went hiking, and ever since I returned, I was just trying to catch up on this past weekend's happenings and whiplash. I have whiplash. Whether you're looking at domestic affairs, whether you're looking at international affairs, it's just so much noise and distortion in the markets. I mean, Trump's tariffs, tit for tat going on. It's you struggle to follow it, and I think a big reason for this is not only the uncertainty that we have no clue exactly where we're going to be in about 90 days, but also just with each announcement you have this document, and then it's almost up to the analysts and all the other experts to go out and figure out exactly what they mean and what this looked like. We saw this with the tariff calculations. I mean, how many people had to deep dive to figure out what was going on? And again, it's just creating so much noise in the markets. And I think particularly one thing that also left a couple of people scratching their heads is the dollar's performance through all of this weakening amid and against this backdrop of chaos.
Yeah, I mean, it is. There's a lot of noise at the moment, and the cross currents are so strong. It's actually very difficult to know when you're that little kite in the middle of all of this as to which direction you're going to take. So, I mean, it is a little bit chaotic. It's not ideal in terms of forecasting or trying to strategically position clients and give them clear guidance on how things might unfold. But this is what we have at the moment. This is the world we live in. I think there's some positives to take out of this as well. I often give this analogy to people just to help them maybe reframe what's going on at the moment. When you are renovating a house, the first thing you're going to do is gut it and break certain walls down before you rebuild it and make it a much nicer house. And I think this is a little bit of what's happening at the moment. Now, I'm not saying that Trump's going to build a nicer house at the end of all of this, but he's certainly going through a renovation. And I think as a result of that, it's causing a lot of people to think very carefully about their own economic policies, their own trade policies, their reliance on the US. All sorts of geopolitical angles are being explored at the moment that wouldn't have been explored had Trump not gone down this road. So I'd like to think that it's making a lot of people in power concentrate, and as a result of that, what ultimately comes out of this is a better situation than what we had going in. Also, just to add that against this backdrop, I think it's important to also note that things couldn't continue the way they were. If you go and have a look at the US's fiscal numbers, they weren't looking good. Now, you might argue, well, tariffs aren't the way to raise the kind of money needed in order to offset tax breaks and whatever Trump wants to implement. But one thing is for sure, the fiscal trajectory that the US was on was not a good one. And if it continued down the path that it was going on, I think it was a ruinous path that ultimately would have resulted in a major collapse of financial markets anyway. So at least this way, it's becoming a position of choice as opposed to one of being dictated to by realization of fundamental truths. So that's what's unfolding in the background. So I would caution people to always just jump onto the narrative that whatever Trump does is bad. It might not be comfortable, and I'm not the hugest Trump supporter, but at the same time, I would turn around and say, just focus on the outcomes that this is going to generate, not so much on the events that are unfolding here and now. Yes, they may be uncomfortable. Yes, it's going to result in some growth headwinds. Yes, we could go into a recession. Yes, to all of those things. And I'm not saying any of them are pleasant, but what I often find coming out of a recession is an economy that has reset itself to a new reality, which is far more capable of being sustainable going forward than the economy that existed pre-recession. And so, some of that context I think is important because it kind of reframes the way we think about and look at these things and potentially allows us to be more constructive in the way that we approach it.
Yes, and that rings true for markets, but also political leaders. I get the impression, especially from the European leaders, that they almost want to bash Trump just because it's Trump. So removing that emotion and taking a practical stance is going to be, I think, the best way forward. So we're going to see how the European is still going to manage, which side they're going to fall to, because I think it was the Spanish president, the prime minister, I'm not sure, who has been, very vocal that they should be aligning with China, or at least, going that route, as opposed to sitting with Trump and trying to figure out the best way forward. So I think it's a fair reminder to take emotion out of it, whether you like the person or not, and just perhaps think pragmatically about how we're going forward. But speaking about pragmatism, the GNU has seemingly taken a step back from the cliff. Now, whether this was, market-induced, markets perhaps forcing the hand of the ANC to be more gentle in tone, I do think that a lot of the ANC internal politics is also playing into this decision, and I will not be surprised whether the stance has softened from, I suppose I can say, the Ramaphosa alliance and faction side of the ANC towards the DA to find a midway for the GNU to continue.
Yeah, Ilse Marie, I think realization is dawning. So the reality is that the major parties, the biggest parties, whether in the GNU or out of the GNU, did not support this VAT increase. And even if you have a look at some of the smaller parties, they only voted for that fiscal framework conditionally. And one of those conditions was that the VAT increase doesn't go through. So quite frankly, you've got more than half the country that doesn't support the VAT increase. So, on what grounds would the ANC have to continuously push for this VAT increase? It's not what the bulk of the country wants. And even within the ANC's ranks, I bet you if you had to take a poll of ANC supporters and ask them if they'd want a VAT increase, you'd probably find that the support for a VAT increase would drop to such a small amount that it would amount to nothing but political suicide for the ANC to push ahead with it. So I don't know why it's taken them so long to come to this realization, but it's a fact. And so now they've got to go back to the drawing board, and I think they've got to reassess their fiscal strategy, because simply relying on just increasing the burden on the tax base to continuously fund a government which is way too big for the size of our tax base is just not a good strategy on any level. So it's about time that we forced the ANC to think differently, to embrace a different ideology, that perhaps a smaller government, less intervention, greater inclusion of the private sector, encouraging foreign capital to come and invest in the country by making our policies a lot more investor friendly, relook at things like BEE and ownership structures and all of that sort of good stuff. We need to get onto this idea of wanting to encourage fixed investment and gross fixed capital formation in this country as the number one priority. That is what's going to boost GDP growth. That's what's going to get people employed. That's what's going to alleviate pressure on the government and its tax revenues. I can't understand why it's taking so long for this realization to dawn on them, but it looks like there may be some steps in the right direction at the very least with the GNU. At least some constructive discussions took place this weekend. Perhaps the GNU does hold it together. Maybe the ANC does need to eat a little bit of humble pie, go back and rethink their budget and come back, and the ministries are going to have to play ball, whether it be a DA-led ministry or an ANC-led ministry, that they need to cut back. And that's just the bottom line. And it's because we've pushed it too far. Our social expenditure is too high relative to the tax base, so we can't spend on anything else. Well, then you've got to think about these things differently. If you're hell-bent on spending so much on social causes, well, then you've got to try and find another way of attracting that capital to the economy, such that you get that growth engine ticking over and rebalancing it through a more productive, constructive growth path, as opposed to simply trying to force an outcome by pulling levers on the part of government.
Exactly. And add to that, cut regulations. I think it's time, just removing some of the red tape for things to start flowing. I just quickly, before we wrap up, want to touch on the headline that had everyone spinning about, the a conservative think tank that suggested that full-scale sanctions could be appropriate for South Africa from Washington. From what I've read from that institution and some of the more leading analysts that's been writing and pushing for, a change in stance towards South Africa, it's coming across more that they will focus on, if it does go ahead, more on ANC-focused individuals sanctions as opposed to widespread sanctions. So to me, I'm getting the impression that is a bit of an alarmist headline. It perhaps was a throwout line in some other discussion that came out, and a narrative was formed around it. It's obviously always possible that something like that can happen. I mean, tariff. Trump has been having us running up and down, so you never know. But I know it was a very alarmist headline. I think just again to get back to that, just think pragmatically. Look through the noise and just take a step back and let's see how this plays out. By the way, the ANC NEC is actually meeting today as well, and they make a final call on the GNU. So hopefully we will have some clarity as we move throughout this week. George, thank you very much. We will chat again next week.
Thank you.